I never thought the hands that fed him, clothed him, and sacrificed everything for 23 years would one day tremble with betrayal. My name is Margaret, and today I want to share with you the most painful lesson of my life. The day I discovered that love without limits can become a prison, and that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. It was a Tuesday afternoon, nothing special about it. I had just returned from my shift at Sunset Manor, where I work as a caregiver for elderly patients. My back was aching from lifting Mrs. Henderson, my uniform smelled of disinfectant, and all I wanted was to sit down with a cup of tea and maybe watch something peaceful on television. I've been doing this job for 15 years now, ever since David's father passed away from cancer when our boy was only 8 years old. 15 years of double shifts, weekend work, and holidays spent caring for other people's parents while raising my own child alone. 15 years of coming home exhausted, with barely enough energy to help with homework or cook a proper dinner. But I did it all because I truly believed, that sacrifice was what love looked like, that a mother's devotion meant putting yourself last, always, without question, without complaint. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. The house was quiet when I walked in. Unusually quiet. David's car was in the driveway, which surprised me because he usually stayed at work until late. At 23, he had landed a decent job at an accounting firm, something I was so proud of. After years of struggling to pay for his education, watching him graduate and find stable employment felt like validation that all my sacrifices had been worth it. I called out his name as I hung up my coat, the same worn blue coat I'd been wearing for 3 winters because new clothes weren't a priority when there were always bills to pay, always something David needed for school or work. "David? You're home early, sweetheart." He appeared in the living room doorway, and something in his posture made my stomach tighten. There was a coldness in his eyes I'd never seen before, a distance that made him feel like a stranger despite the fact that I'd carried him in my womb, nursed him through every childhood illness, sat by his bedside during countless fevered nights. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and those 4 words carried a weight that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. There was no warmth in his voice, no affection, just business. Cold, calculated business. I set down my purse and looked at him, really looked at him. When had he become so tall, so imposing? When had his voice taken on that tone of authority that reminded me uncomfortably of his father during their worst arguments? "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" He didn't sit down, didn't invite me to sit down. Instead, he stood there with his arms crossed, looking down at me like I was one of his clients, someone he needed to manage rather than his mother who had given up everything for him. "I've been thinking about your financial situation," he began, and I felt the first stab of unease. "You're 55 years old, Mom. You're not getting any younger. And let's be honest, you've never been good with money. You work all these hours and still struggle to make ends meet. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing? The word hit me like a slap. Embarrassing to whom? To him? Was I an embarrassment to the son I'd raised, the child I'd put through school by working jobs that left my hands raw and my back screaming in pain? "I don't understand what you're getting at, David," I said softly, my voice already beginning to shake with an emotion I couldn't quite name yet. Fear? Hurt? Something darker that I didn't want to acknowledge. "What I'm getting at," he continued, his voice growing more confident, more authoritative, "is that things are going to change around here. You're going to transfer your direct deposit to my account. All of it. Every paycheck from now on comes to me, and I'll manage everything. The bills, the groceries, your spending money. I'll give you an allowance." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. An allowance. He wanted to give me an allowance from money I earned by caring for people who couldn't care for themselves, money I earned by sacrificing my health and my comfort and my dreams. "David, I think there's been some misunderstanding," I stammered, my hands reaching for the back of the couch to steady myself. "That's my salary. That's how I support us. How I support this house." His laugh was sharp and cruel, a sound I'd never heard from my gentle boy. My sweet child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me he loved me more than all the stars in the sky. Support us? He repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. Mom, look around. Look at this place. Look at yourself. You call this supporting us? This is barely surviving and it's pathetic. I make 3 times what you make. And yet I'm still living in this dump, still dealing with the shame of having a mother who works as a glorified maid. Each word was a knife between my ribs, twisting deeper with every syllable. A glorified maid. That's what he thought of the work that had kept a roof over our heads, food on our table, clothes on his back through all those years when it was just the 2 of us against the world. Those people you work with at the firm, he continued, pacing now like a lawyer making his closing argument. They have mothers who play tennis at country clubs, who volunteer for charity galas, who don't smell like antiseptic and exhaustion. Do you understand how that makes me look? I sank into the couch, my legs no longer able to support me. 23 years of love, of sacrifice, of believing that everything I did was building toward a future where my son would be grateful, where he would understand that every choice I made was for him. And this is what it had built toward. Shame. His shame of me. David, please, I whispered, tears starting to blur my vision. I've worked so hard to give you everything you needed. The private tutoring when you struggled with math, the laptop for college, the car payments when you needed transportation for internships. Everything I've done has been for you. Exactly, he said. And there was a coldness in his smile that made my blood run cold. Everything you've done has been for me, which means you owe me. You owe me for all those years of struggle. All those times I had to watch other kids get things I couldn't have because you were too incompetent to provide better. You owe me for making me grow up in this mediocrity. The room was spinning now. Or maybe it was just my world that was tilting off its axis. Owe him? I owed him for raising him alone, for working myself into exhaustion to give him opportunities I'd never had. I owed him for loving him unconditionally, for believing in him when teachers said he was lazy, for defending him when neighbors complained about his teenage rebellions. From now on, he said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what looked like banking apps, I'll handle everything. I've already researched the best way to do this legally. You're going to sign papers giving me power of attorney over your finances, and we're going to set up automatic deposits. You'll get what you need to survive, and I'll make sure the money is actually put to good use for once. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, speaking with my son's voice, but carrying the heart of someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at his mother who had given up dating, given up friendships, given up dreams of travel or hobbies or anything that might take time or money away from providing for him, and see nothing but an inconvenience to be managed. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile grew wider, colder. Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live. This house is in both our names, Mom. I contribute to the mortgage now. I could easily argue that you're no longer financially stable enough to maintain your half of the responsibility. Do you really want to test me on this? The threat hung between us like a sword, and I realized with crystal clarity that I was looking at a stranger. The boy I had raised, the child I had loved more than my own life, was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to the lifestyle he felt he deserved. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a terrible nightmare, but the cold silence that greeted me at breakfast told me otherwise. David sat at the kitchen table, dressed in his expensive suit, scrolling through his phone while eating the eggs I had prepared for him out of habit. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I poured myself coffee with shaking hands, the ceramic mug nearly slipping from my fingers. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with unspoken tension and the weight of his ultimatum from the night before. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said softly, desperate to restore some normalcy, some hint of the relationship we used to have. He glanced up briefly, his eyes cold and impatient. "I've already contacted HR at my office. They're sending over the paperwork today for the financial arrangements we discussed. You'll need to sign everything by tomorrow." No good morning. No acknowledgement that I was his mother. The woman who had packed his lunch every day for 12 years, who had stayed up nights helping him with school projects, who had celebrated every small victory in his life as if it were my own. David, please, can't we talk about this more? Maybe we can find another solution. There is no other solution, Mom. His voice was sharp, cutting. This is what's best for both of us. You'll understand eventually. He stood up, leaving his dirty plate on the table for me to clean, just like when he was a teenager. But this wasn't teenage carelessness. This was deliberate dismissal, a statement about who he believed was responsible for serving whom in this house. That afternoon, his girlfriend Sarah came by for the first time in months. I had always tried to be welcoming to her, cooking her favorite meals when she visited, asking about her job at the marketing firm, treating her like the daughter I'd never had. But something was different this time. She sat in my living room, looking around with barely concealed disdain at the modest furniture, the family photos on the walls, the crocheted afghans my mother had made that I treasured. When I offered her tea, she declined with a wave of her hand, as if the very idea of accepting anything from me was distasteful. David told me about the new arrangements, she said, her voice carrying a tone of approval that made my stomach twist. It's really for the best, Mrs. Morrison. You'll have so much less stress now that you don't have to worry about managing money. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. She spoke to me like I was a child, incapable of handling adult responsibilities. This young woman, barely 25, who had never worked a day of manual labor in her life, was talking down to me about stress and responsibility. I've been managing money and raising a family since before you were born, dear, I said quietly, trying to maintain my composure. Sarah's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Well, clearly not very successfully, or David wouldn't need to step in now. She gestured around the room with obvious distaste. He deserves better than this. We both do. We both do. The words hit me like a physical blow. She was already thinking of herself as part of the equation, already planning a future that apparently didn't include me or any respect for what I had built. David emerged from his old bedroom, where he'd been on a work call, and the transformation in his demeanor was immediate. With Sarah, he was charming, attentive, the loving boyfriend. With me, he was cold, businesslike, barely tolerant of my presence in my own home. Sarah and I have been looking at apartments, he announced, not bothering to sit down. We found a really nice place downtown. 2 bedrooms, modern kitchen, all the amenities. My heart sank. You're moving out? Eventually, he said, his tone suggesting this was obvious. But don't worry, I'll still be managing your finances remotely. It's actually better this way. I won't have to see how you waste money on unnecessary things. Sarah nodded in agreement, sliding her arm through his possessively. David's been telling me how worried he's been about you, Mrs. Morrison. How you spend money on things like expensive coffee and those little decorations. She gestured toward the ceramic angels on my mantelpiece. Gifts from coworkers over the years that brought me small moments of joy. It's really irresponsible at your age. Expensive coffee. She was talking about the one small luxury I allowed myself. A better brand of coffee that cost $3 more than the cheapest option. After working double shifts, after coming home exhausted and aching, that cup of coffee in the morning was sometimes the only thing that made the day feel bearable. Those aren't expensive decorations, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They're gifts from friends. Friends at work don't count as real friends, Mom, David said dismissively. Those people only talk to you because you're forced to work together. Once you retire, you'll see how quickly they forget about you. The cruelty in his words took my breath away. He was systematically dismantling everything I found comfort in. My small pleasures, my relationships, my sense of competence and worth. And Sarah stood beside him, nodding as if his assessment was perfectly reasonable. That evening, after they left to have dinner at some expensive restaurant I could never afford, I sat alone in my kitchen and tried to understand how I had failed so completely. Where had I gone wrong? Had I loved too much? Given too freely? Protected him too well from the struggles that might have taught him empathy and gratitude? I thought about his father, James, and wondered what he would say if he could see what our son had become. James had been a good man, hard-working and kind, who treated me like a partner rather than a servant. He would be horrified to see David speaking to me this way, treating me like a burden rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise his child. The paperwork arrived the next day, just as David had promised. Legal documents full of incomprehensible language about financial guardianship, power of attorney, and asset management. The letterhead was from an expensive law firm downtown, the kind of place that charged more for one consultation than I made in a week. When David came home that evening, he spread the documents across the kitchen table with the efficiency of someone conducting a business transaction. No emotion, no acknowledgement of what this meant for me, for us, for the relationship we had shared for 23 years. "Sign here, here, and here," he said, pointing to highlighted lines with his expensive pen. "Sarah's friend works at this law firm. She made sure everything is legal and binding." I stared at the papers, understanding enough to know that signing them would essentially make me a ward of my own son. My bank account, my paycheck, my financial independence, all of it would belong to him. I would have to ask permission to buy groceries, to purchase medication, to replace worn-out clothes. "What if I need something urgent?" I asked. "What if there's an emergency?" "Then you'll call me, and I'll decide if it's really necessary," he said, his tone suggesting this was perfectly reasonable. "That's the point, Mom. No more impulsive spending, no more wasting money on things you don't need." I looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared, who used to tell me I was the best mommy in the whole world, who used to draw me pictures and hang them on the refrigerator with pride. That little boy was gone. In his place stood a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a financial liability, an embarrassment to be managed and controlled. And as I sat there with the pen in my trembling hand, I realized that the love I had given so freely, so completely, had somehow transformed into the weapon he was now using to destroy my independence and dignity. The pen felt heavy in my hand, heavier than any burden I had carried during all those years of struggle and sacrifice, because I knew that once I signed these papers, I would disappear completely, not just as a person, but as his mother. I would become nothing more than an expense account to be monitored, a problem to be solved, a reminder of a past he was eager to leave behind. I couldn't sign those papers. Not that night, not the next day, not even when David's calls became increasingly aggressive and demanding. For 3 days, I carried those documents with me everywhere, to work, to the grocery store, to bed, like evidence of my own potential surrender. On the 4th day, I decided to try one more time to reach the son I remembered, the boy who used to need me. I cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, the same dinner I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 5. I set the table with our good plates, the ones we only used for special occasions, and lit a candle in the center. When he walked through the door that evening, his face immediately darkened at the sight of my efforts. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone already annoyed before I could even explain. "I thought we could have dinner together," I said, my voice hopeful despite the knot in my stomach. "Like we used to. Remember how you always said nobody could make pot roast like Mom?" He looked at the table with obvious irritation, checking his expensive watch. "I don't have time for this, Mom. Sarah and I have dinner reservations at 8. You're wasting money on this elaborate meal when you should be learning to budget properly." "It's not elaborate, David. It's just dinner. It's us." I stood beside the table I'd spent an hour preparing, feeling foolish and desperate. "Can't you spare 30 minutes to eat with your mother?" 30 minutes? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, this whole situation is exactly what I'm talking about. You live in this fantasy where we're still some cozy little family, where you're still the center of my world. I'm 23 years old. I have a career, a girlfriend, a life. I can't keep pretending that sitting here eating your cooking is the highlight of my day." Each word was carefully chosen to wound, delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. The candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows that made his face look unfamiliar, almost sinister. "When I was 8 and had no choice, sure, this was fine," he continued, gesturing dismissively at the table. "But I'm not 8 anymore, and frankly, neither are you. It's time to grow up and accept that things have changed." I felt something crack inside my chest, a sound only I could hear. "Things have changed? David? I'm your mother. That doesn't change. Biologically, yes. But emotionally? Practically? He shrugged as if discussing the weather. You've become a burden, Mom. An obligation I inherited when Dad died, but not one I'm required to carry forever. The word burden echoed in the small dining room, bouncing off the walls like a curse. I had carried him for 9 months, fed him from my own body, sacrificed my youth and my dreams to ensure he never felt like a burden to anyone. And now he was returning that gift by making me feel like the most unwanted thing in his world. I never asked you to carry me, I whispered, my hands shaking as I reached to blow out the candle. I never asked for anything but to love you. Love? His voice turned sharp, cruel. Mom, you don't love me. You love the idea of being needed. You love feeling like a martyr, like the poor widow who sacrificed everything for her ungrateful son. But that's not love. That's emotional manipulation. I stared at him in the growing darkness. The candle extinguished, the room suddenly cold despite the warmth from the kitchen. Emotional manipulation. Was that what he thought all those years had been? All those nights I'd stayed up with him during stomach flu. All those times I'd worked extra shifts to pay for things he wanted. All those moments when I'd put his needs before my own health, my own happiness, my own basic human needs? The phone rang then, and David answered it immediately, his voice transforming into warmth and charm as soon as he heard Sarah's voice on the other end. Hey, beautiful, he said, turning his back to me as if I had simply vanished from the room. Yeah, I'm just finishing up here. Give me 5 minutes and I'll pick you up. He hung up and grabbed his keys from the counter, stepping around the table I'd prepared as if it were an obstacle rather than an offering. Get rid of all this, he said, waving his hand at the food I'd spent hours preparing. And Mom? Sign those papers. I'm not going to keep asking nicely. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with the cooling pot roast and the weight of my complete invisibility. I sat in the dark for a long time, surrounded by the remnants of my failed attempt to connect with someone who no longer saw me as human. The next week brought fresh humiliations. David began bringing Sarah around more frequently, and she seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out my inadequacies. She would run her finger along furniture to check for dust, comment on the outdated decor, suggest that perhaps I was letting myself go because I hadn't had my hair professionally styled in months. Mrs. Morrison, she said one afternoon while David was in the shower, you know, there are some really nice assisted living facilities in town. Places where you could have friends your own age, activities designed for seniors, professional meal service. Wouldn't that be so much better than struggling to maintain this big house all by yourself? I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed David breakfast every morning for 15 years, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd planned his high school graduation party together. I'm 55, Sarah, I said quietly, not looking up from the towels I was folding. I'm not ready for assisted living. Well, maybe not traditionally, she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone I'd grown to dread. But let's be honest, you're not exactly thriving here. David's worried about you living alone, especially once he moves out. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? Who would even know? She was painting a picture of me as frail, helpless, a danger to myself, all to justify what David wanted to do anyway. And the worst part was that some small, tired part of me was beginning to believe her. When David emerged from the bathroom, hair perfectly styled, cologne filling the air, Sarah immediately shifted into her adoring girlfriend role. I was just telling your mom about those nice senior communities we saw advertised, she said, sliding her arm through his. Some of them are really beautiful, with gardens and activities and medical staff right on site. That's actually not a bad idea, David said, looking at me with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock. You're getting older, Mom. Your job is physically demanding. How much longer can you really keep lifting elderly patients and working double shifts? They were discussing my future as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away from them, as if my voice and my choices meant nothing. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, invisible and powerless while other people made decisions about my body, my home, my remaining years. I love my job, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. The people I care for depend on me. Sarah and David exchanged a look, one of those silent communications between couples that excluded everyone else in the room. Mom, David said with exaggerated patience, Those people have families, professional caregivers, medical staff. They don't depend on you specifically. You're replaceable there, just like everyone else. Replaceable. Another word that lodged itself in my chest like a shard of glass. At work, where I took pride in knowing each patient's preferences, where I remembered their grandchildren's names and their favorite songs, where I provided not just medical care, but human comfort and dignity. Even there, I was replaceable. Besides, Sarah added with false sweetness, wouldn't it be nice to relax for once? To let other people take care of you for a change? But I didn't want to be taken care of. I wanted to matter, to contribute, to feel like my presence in the world made some small difference. I wanted to wake up each morning with purpose rather than resignation. I wanted to feel like Margaret Morrison, not just David's inconvenient mother who needed to be managed and contained. That night, after they left for another expensive dinner, I sat in my bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, defeated, smaller somehow than she had just months before. My hair was graying at the temples. My hands were rough from years of manual labor. My shoulders were permanently curved from bending over hospital beds and lifting patients who couldn't lift themselves. But my eyes still held something David and Sarah hadn't managed to extinguish yet. Call it defiance, call it dignity, call it the stubborn refusal to disappear completely just because other people found my existence inconvenient. I pulled out the unsigned papers and spread them across my dresser, reading them again by the light of my bedside lamp. But this time, instead of feeling trapped, I felt something else beginning to stir deep in my chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it wasn't surrender either. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was the recognition that I still had choices, even if David and Sarah couldn't see them. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remind them both that underestimating me was the biggest mistake they could make. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I had just returned from one of the most difficult shifts of my career. Mrs. Patterson, an 87-year-old woman I'd been caring for over 2 years, had passed away during my shift. She died holding my hand, her final words a whispered, "Thank you," that broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. I drove home in the rain, tears mixing with the droplets on my windshield, thinking about how Mrs. Patterson used to tell me stories about her late husband, how she'd light up when I brought her favorite tea, how she'd always ask about David and beam with pride when I told her about his achievements. She saw me as a whole person, not just a caregiver, and now she was gone. When I walked through my front door, I found David and Sarah in my living room with another couple I'd never met before. They were drinking wine, expensive wine from bottles I knew I hadn't purchased, and the coffee table was covered with real estate brochures and legal documents. "Oh, good. You're home," David said without looking up from the papers. "Mom, these are my friends Jake and Michelle. Jake's a real estate agent." I stood in my own doorway, still wearing my work uniform that smelled of antiseptic and grief, holding the small box of personal items Mrs. Patterson's family had asked me to take, photos she'd kept on her nightstand, a ceramic bird she'd loved, a book of poetry worn soft from decades of reading. "Real estate agent?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake, a man in his 30s wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, stood up with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Morrison, David's told me so much about you. I've been looking at your property values, and I have to say, you're sitting on a gold mine here." Sarah giggled, actually giggled, as if this was all some delightful game. "Tell her about the market analysis, Jake." "Well," Jake continued, spreading more papers across my coffee table as if he owned the place, "this neighborhood has seen a 23% increase in property values over the last 18 months. A house like this, with some updates, could easily sell for 40% more than you paid for it." I looked at David, searching his face for some explanation, some sign that this wasn't what it appeared to be. But his expression was cold, businesslike, the same look he gave when discussing quarterly reports at work. "We've been thinking," David said, finally meeting my eyes, "that selling the house would solve a lot of problems. You could use your portion of the proceeds to secure a really nice spot at Sunset Gardens. That's the assisted living facility Sarah found. I could use my portion to get a proper apartment with Sarah. Maybe even start thinking about buying our own place eventually. My portion. He was already dividing up the house James and I had bought together, the home where I'd raised our son, where every room held memories of laughter and tears and the quiet daily miracles of family life. "This is my home," I said, clutching Mrs. Patterson's memory box against my chest like armor. "Our home. Your father and I chose this house together. You took your first steps on this kitchen floor." "Mom, sentiment doesn't pay bills or build futures," David replied with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a slow child. "You're being emotional instead of practical." Michelle, Jake's wife, leaned forward with false sympathy. "Mrs. Morrison, change is always hard, but think about how much easier your life will be when you don't have to worry about maintenance, property taxes, utilities. And Sunset Gardens has such wonderful programs for people your age." People my age. I was 55 years old, not 95. But they were all talking about me as if I were already 1 foot in the grave, ready to shuffle off to some sterile facility where I could wait quietly to die without inconveniencing anyone. "The beauty of this plan," Jake continued enthusiastically, "is that everyone wins. David gets the financial freedom to start his adult life properly. You get security and care, and the house goes to a young family who can really appreciate it. A young family who could really appreciate it. As if I, the woman who had spent 15 years making this house a home, who had painted every room, planted every flower in the garden, repaired every squeaky door and leaky faucet, as if I couldn't appreciate the home I'd created with my own hands and heart. I looked around the living room, seeing it suddenly through their eyes. Outdated furniture, family photos they considered clutter, the handmade quilts my mother had given me that they saw as old-fashioned. They weren't seeing my home. They were seeing square footage and market potential. "I need to think about this," I said, my voice barely audible. "There's nothing to think about, Mom," David said, standing up and straightening his tie. "We've already run the numbers. Jake's prepared to list the house as soon as you're ready. The application for Sunset Gardens just needs your signature. Everything's been arranged. Everything's been arranged, without me. They had planned my entire future. Where I would live, how I would spend my remaining years, what would happen to the home I loved, and I was expected to simply agree, to sign papers and smile gratefully for their thoughtfulness in managing my life. "We should go," Sarah said, gathering up her purse and giving David a meaningful look. "Let your mom process all this good news." Good news. She called the destruction of my independence and the sale of my home good news. After they left, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by the scattered real estate brochures and legal documents that represented the final phase of my erasure. The house felt different now, contaminated by their presence and their plans. Every familiar object, every cherished photograph, every comfortable chair suddenly looked temporary, already belonging to the past rather than the present. I walked through each room slowly, really seeing it for perhaps the last time as my home rather than a commodity to be sold. The kitchen where I'd taught David to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. The bathroom where I'd given him countless baths, where we'd practiced his multiplication tables while he soaked in bubbles. His bedroom, still decorated with superhero posters from his teenage years, posters I'd kept up because they reminded me of when he still thought I was one of the good guys. In my own bedroom, I opened the jewelry box James had given me for our 10th anniversary. Inside, beneath the few pieces of modest jewelry I owned, was the deed to the house. My name was on it, right next to James's, in the careful handwriting we'd both used to sign the most important document of our married life. But I also found something else I'd forgotten was there. A letter James had written to me during his final hospital stay, when he knew he was dying but I was still refusing to accept it. I'd been so focused on treatments and hope that I'd barely been able to listen to his attempts to prepare me for life without him. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands, his familiar handwriting blurry through my tears. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're facing the world alone with our boy. I know you're scared. I know it feels impossible, but I need you to remember something. You are stronger than you believe, smarter than you think, and worth more than anyone will ever be able to convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone, not even David, make you feel small. You raised a good man, but if he ever forgets the sacrifices you made for him, don't you forget your own worth. You have more power than you know. Use it if you need to. I love you always. James. I read the letter 3 times, hearing James's voice in every word, feeling his presence in the room with me for the first time since his death. He had known. Somehow he had known that someday I might need to be reminded of my own strength, my own value, my own power. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about what David wanted or what Sarah expected or what other people thought was best for me. I was thinking about what James had seen in me, what Mrs. Patterson had appreciated about me, what I had somehow forgotten about myself in the face of constant criticism and dismissal. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be managed. I was Margaret Morrison, a woman who had survived widowhood and single motherhood and 15 years of backbreaking work. I was a woman who had built a life, raised a child, and earned every single thing I owned through my own labor and sacrifice. And I was a woman who still had choices. David and Sarah and their real estate friend had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed I was powerless simply because I had been quiet. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my willingness to sacrifice for inability to fight back. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they couldn't see or understand or take away from me. I had the patience that comes from years of caring for others, the strength that comes from surviving loss, and the quiet determination of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. I folded James's letter carefully and put it back in the jewelry box, right next to the deed with my name on it. Tomorrow, I would start making some calls of my own. But tonight, for the first time in months, I wasn't crying myself to sleep. Tonight, I was planning. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While David slept in his childhood bedroom, probably dreaming about his new apartment and his bright future without his inconvenient mother, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and began to really think. For weeks, I had been reacting to their demands, their plans, their vision of my future. I had been defensive, hurt, scrambling to hold on to pieces of a life they were systematically dismantling. But James's letter had reminded me of something crucial. I didn't have to play defense. I could play offense. I started by making a list, something I hadn't done since David was small, and I used to plan our weeks to make sure every need was met and every dollar stretched as far as possible. But this wasn't a list of groceries or chores. This was a list of assets, resources, and truths that David and Sarah had overlooked in their eagerness to write me off as a helpless burden. First, the house. Yes, my name was on the deed alongside James's. But what David didn't know was that after James died, I had taken out a small life insurance policy on myself and used part of the payout to pay down a significant portion of the mortgage. The house had more equity than he realized, and more importantly, I had more ownership than he assumed. Second, my job. While they saw it as menial labor performed by someone too incompetent to do anything better, I saw 15 years of building relationships, earning respect, and developing skills that went far beyond what appeared on my paycheck. I knew things about elder care, about medical procedures, about managing difficult family dynamics that made me valuable in ways they couldn't understand. Third, my knowledge of David himself. I had raised him. I knew his weaknesses, his fears, his carefully hidden secrets. I knew about the academic probation in college that he'd hidden from me for months. I knew about the credit card debt he'd accumulated and lied about. Most importantly, I knew about the incident during his senior year that had nearly derailed his graduation, something that even Sarah didn't know about. I spent my lunch break that day at the public library, using their computers to research things I'd never needed to know before. Legal aid services for people facing elder abuse. Because yes, I was beginning to understand that what David was doing to me had a name, and it was illegal. Financial planning resources for single women over 50. Housing options that didn't involve surrendering my independence to an assisted living facility. But most importantly, I researched something David had mentioned in passing weeks ago, his company's strict ethics policies. The accounting firm where he worked had very specific rules about conflicts of interest, financial impropriety, and maintaining professional standards. They took particular pride in their reputation for integrity, something they emphasized heavily in their marketing materials. When I got home that evening, David was waiting for me with Sarah and another couple, this time someone he introduced as a financial advisor. "Mom, this is Robert Chen. He specializes in retirement planning for people transitioning to assisted living. I thought it would be helpful for you to understand how your finances will work once we implement the new arrangement." Robert was younger than David, probably fresh out of college, with the eager enthusiasm of someone building a client base. He had prepared charts and graphs showing how my assets could be managed to provide sustainable income for my golden years. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, spreading his materials across my coffee table like he was selling me a car. "Based on the information David provided about your income and expenses, I've developed a comprehensive plan that will ensure your financial security while also allowing your son to optimize his own investment strategy." They had been talking about my money, my future, my life without me. David had given this stranger access to information about my finances, had authorized him to make plans for money I had earned through my own labor. "What information did you provide?" I asked David, my voice calm despite the rage building in my chest. "Just the basics," David said dismissively. "Your salary, your savings account balance, the estimated value of your share of the house. Everything Robert needed to help us make smart decisions. Everything Robert needed. As if I weren't capable of making my own decisions. As if my money and my future were naturally David's to manage." "I see," I said quietly, and something in my tone made Sarah look up from her phone with sudden attention. Robert continued his presentation, explaining how the sale of the house would provide a nest egg that could be invested conservatively to provide monthly income for living expenses at Sunset Gardens. The way he talked, you'd think he was describing a wonderful opportunity rather than the complete dissolution of my independence. "Of course," he added, "David would maintain power of attorney to ensure that investment decisions remain sound and that spending stays within appropriate parameters for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation, a 55-year-old woman who worked full-time, owned half a house, and had managed her own finances successfully for decades, was apparently in a situation that required professional intervention and familial control. I listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, nodding occasionally, asking a few questions that made me sound interested rather than increasingly furious. When Robert finished, I thanked him politely and walked him to the door, playing the role of the grateful mother who was overwhelmed by all this helpful planning. "You're so lucky to have a son who cares enough to handle these complicated matters for you," Robert said as he gathered his materials. "A lot of elderly people struggle with these transitions because they don't have family support." Elderly people. I was 55 years old, and this child was talking about me like I was 90 and suffering from dementia. After Robert left, David and Sarah settled in for what was clearly meant to be a family meeting where they would pressure me into signing various documents. "So, what did you think?" Sarah asked with false brightness. "Robert really knows his stuff, doesn't he?" "Very impressive," I said, sitting across from them in my own living room. "I'm curious about something, though." David's expression became wary. In all our recent confrontations, I had never been curious. I had been defensive, hurt, pleading. Curiosity was something new, and it made him uncomfortable. "When you gave Robert access to my financial information," I continued, "did you happen to mention that sharing personal financial data without someone's explicit consent is illegal? Or that financial advisors are required by law to verify that they're speaking with the actual account holder before providing services?" The room went very quiet. Sarah's smile faltered, and David's confident posture shifted slightly. "Mom, he's helping us plan. He's helping you plan," I corrected. "Without my authorization, using information you had no right to share. I'm sure it was an oversight, but I thought you should know that what happened here tonight could be considered financial fraud if anyone chose to report it." David's face flushed red, the way it used to when he was caught lying as a teenager. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," I said calmly. "The same way I educated you about right and wrong when you were growing up. Some lessons take longer to sink in than others." Sarah stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse with sharp, angry movements. "David, maybe we should go. Your mother obviously isn't ready to have a rational conversation about this. You're right, I agreed, walking to the front door and opening it. I'm not ready to have a conversation about my future that doesn't include me as an equal participant. When you're ready to discuss this with me rather than about me, let me know. They left without another word, but I could hear them arguing in the driveway before their car doors slammed. David's voice was high and frustrated, Sarah's sharp and critical. They hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't expected knowledge of laws and rights and consequences. That night, I made more lists. Phone numbers for legal aid services. Names of elder law attorneys who offered free consultations. Contact information for David's Human Resources Department, carefully copied from the company website. Bank numbers for opening new accounts. Addresses for safe deposit boxes. But most importantly, I made a list of things David had forgotten I knew about him, starting with the incident from his senior year of college, the one that could still damage his reputation if the right people found out about it. The one he thought was buried so deep that it could never surface to cause him problems. I wasn't planning to use that information. Not yet. But it was good to know I had it. Good to remember that in any battle, knowledge was power. And I had knowledge he didn't know I possessed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't thinking like a victim. I was thinking like a strategist. And tomorrow, I would start making the calls that would remind my son that underestimating his mother was the biggest mistake he could possibly make. The woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for his success, who had taught him everything he knew about determination and perseverance, that woman was still here. She had just been quiet for a while, gathering her strength, but quiet time was over. It was time for Margaret Morrison to remind everyone exactly who she was and what she was capable of when pushed too far. The next few weeks passed in a strange calm that I'm sure David and Sarah mistook for resignation. They gave me space, probably thinking I was processing their generous plans and would eventually come around to signing the papers that would hand over control of my life. They couldn't have been more wrong. While they celebrated what they assumed was my compliance, I was busy. During my lunch breaks at work, I met with Eleanor Rodriguez, a legal aid attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Eleanor was a sharp woman in her 40s who listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard for the first time in months. What your son is doing has several legal names, she told me during our second meeting. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, coercive control, and attempted fraud. The fact that he's pressuring you to sign over financial power of attorney while threatening your housing security makes this a particularly serious case. As she helped me understand that I had more power than I'd realized. The house couldn't be sold without my signature. My bank accounts couldn't be transferred without my explicit consent. David's threats about forcing me out were largely empty. Evicting a homeowner, especially one who was current on mortgage payments, was nearly impossible. The most important thing, Eleanor explained, is documentation. We need evidence of his attempts to coerce you, his threats, his unauthorized sharing of your financial information. Do you have any of that? I thought about all the conversations, all the legal documents he'd pressured me to sign, all the meetings with financial advisors and real estate agents conducted in my own home without my permission. Not yet, I said, but I can get it. That afternoon, I stopped by the electronics store and purchased something I'd never owned before. A small digital recording device that could fit in my purse. The young man who sold it to me explained how it worked, how long the battery lasted, how to download the files to a computer. I practiced with it at home until I could operate it without looking, until starting a recording became as natural as turning on a light switch. I also opened a new bank account at a different institution, one where David had no history or connections. I didn't transfer large amounts, that would have been too obvious, but I began redirecting my direct deposit there, starting with just a portion of my paycheck. Every week, a little more of my financial independence moved beyond his reach. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came on a Saturday afternoon when David arrived with Sarah and a new person, someone he introduced as Patricia Walsh, a care coordinator from Sunset Gardens. "Mom, Patricia's here to talk about the admission process," David announced, ushering them into my living room like he was hosting a business meeting. "She can explain all the wonderful amenities and services they provide." Patricia was a professional woman in her 50s, dressed in the kind of expensive suit that suggested Sunset Gardens charged premium prices for their services. She had brought glossy brochures and iPad presentations, showing smiling elderly people enjoying various activities. "Mrs. Morrison," she began with practiced warmth, "David has told me so much about you. He's such a devoted son, so concerned about ensuring you have the best possible care as you enter this new phase of your life." I smiled and nodded, my hand resting casually on my purse where the recording device was silently capturing every word. "Please, tell me about your facility." For the next 30 minutes, Patricia painted a picture of communal dining rooms, organized activities, and medical staff on call 24 hours a day. It sounded pleasant enough if you were someone who actually needed that level of care and supervision. "Now, the admission process does require some financial documentation," Patricia continued, pulling out forms that looked remarkably similar to the legal documents David had been pressuring me to sign. "We'll need to verify income sources, understand asset distribution, and ensure that payment arrangements are sustainable long-term." "What kind of asset distribution?" I asked innocently. David leaned forward eagerly. "Patricia, as I mentioned, my mother owns half of a house that we'll be selling to fund her care. I'll be managing her finances going forward to ensure stability." "Excellent," Patricia nodded approvingly. "Many families find that arrangement works best. Adult children often have better investment knowledge and can make more objective decisions about resource management." "And what happens if someone changes their mind?" I asked. "If they decide they don't actually want to live in a facility like yours?" Patricia's smile became slightly strained. "Well, once the financial commitments are made and the care plan is established, it becomes quite difficult to reverse those arrangements. The contracts are designed to protect both the resident and the facility from impulsive decisions that might not be in everyone's best interest." There it was, the trap David was trying to guide me into. Once I signed these papers, once my house was sold and my assets transferred, once I was established as a resident who needed supervision, my choices would effectively disappear. "I see," I said calmly. "And how much advance notice would someone need to give if they wanted to terminate their residency?" "Mom," David interrupted with barely concealed irritation, "why are you asking about terminating? This is about finding you a safe, comfortable place to live." "I'm just trying to understand all my options," I replied, keeping my voice gentle and confused, like someone who was overwhelmed by complex decisions. "It's a lot to process." Sarah, who had been scrolling through her phone during most of the presentation, looked up with obvious impatience. "Mrs. Morrison, this is a wonderful opportunity. Most people would be grateful to have family members willing to handle these complicated arrangements." "Oh, I am grateful," I said, and I meant it, though not in the way she thought. I was grateful for this recorded evidence of their scheme, grateful for Patricia's casual admissions about how difficult it would be to reverse these arrangements, grateful for David's clear statement that he intended to manage my finances. After they left, I sat in my kitchen and listened to the recording twice, making notes about the most damaging statements. Eleanor would be very interested in David's explicit claims about managing my finances and Patricia's admissions about the irreversible nature of their contracts, but I wasn't finished gathering evidence. Over the next week, I began asking David direct questions about his plans, always when I could record our conversations. I played the role of the confused, overwhelmed mother who was struggling to understand what was happening to her life. "David, honey," I said one evening after dinner, "I'm still not clear about something. If I sign these papers giving you control of my finances, what happens if I disagree with one of your decisions?" He looked up from his laptop with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Mom, that's the whole point. You won't have to worry about making decisions anymore. I'll handle everything. But what if I want to buy something you think is unnecessary? Then you don't buy it," he said simply. "That's what financial management means. Someone with better judgment makes the decisions." Perfect. Another recording of David explicitly stating his intention to control my purchases and decisions. "And the house," I continued. "Once it's sold, I won't be able to change my mind about that?" "Mom, you can't change your mind about selling something after it's already sold," he said with exaggerated patience. "That's not how real estate works. But what if I decide I don't want to live at Sunset Gardens after all? David's expression darkened. Mom, we've been over this. You're not capable of living independently anymore. That's not your choice to make. Not my choice to make. Those words, captured clearly on my recording device, would be very interesting to Eleanor and potentially to David's employer, who prided themselves on ethical behavior and community responsibility. The most valuable recording came 3 days later, when Sarah arrived at the house without David. She seemed agitated, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. Mrs. Morrison, we need to talk, she said, her usual false sweetness replaced by barely controlled frustration. David's being too patient with you. This whole process should have been finished weeks ago. I activated the recording device and settled into my chair, projecting the image of someone who was intimidated and overwhelmed. I'm trying to understand everything, Sarah. It's just so complicated. It's not complicated, she snapped. You sign the papers, we sell the house, you move to the facility, and everyone can get on with their lives. David's career is suffering because he's constantly worried about this situation. His career is suffering? Yes. His colleagues are talking about his family situation, wondering why he can't handle something as simple as getting his mother proper care. It's embarrassing for him professionally. There it was. Confirmation that this was about David's image, his comfort, his professional reputation rather than my well-being. And frankly, Sarah continued, warming to her subject, you're being selfish. David has done everything for you, and this is how you repay him? By making his life difficult when all he's trying to do is help? I've supported David his entire life, I said quietly. I've worked double shifts to pay for his education, sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. How is that being selfish? Sarah's laugh was harsh and cold. That was your job as his mother. You don't get credit for doing what you were supposed to do. But David doesn't owe you anything just because you chose to have a child. The words hit like physical blows. But I kept my expression neutral, my voice steady. So you think children owe their parents nothing? I think children owe their parents respect and gratitude, but not their entire lives, Sarah replied. David has his own future to think about. We want to get married, buy a house, start our own family. He can't do that while he's supporting a mother who refuses to act her age. Supporting me? I was the one working full-time while they planned to liquidate my assets for their benefit. But I said nothing. Just let her continue talking, letting her reveal exactly what she thought of me and what they had planned. When she finally left, I had recordings of the most damaging conversation yet. Sarah's casual cruelty, her admission that this was about their plans rather than my needs, her clear statement that they saw me as an obstacle to their future happiness. That night, I made copies of all my recordings and stored them in the safe deposit box I'd rented at the bank where I'd opened my new account. Eleanor would be very interested in what I'd gathered, but more importantly, I was beginning to understand something that filled me with quiet satisfaction. David and Sarah thought they were so much smarter than me, so much more sophisticated and capable. But they had made the amateur mistake of underestimating their opponent. They had forgotten that the woman who had raised David, who had navigated 15 years as a single mother, who had managed to survive and even thrive under impossible circumstances, was still very much present and very much aware. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and they had no idea. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after David had first demanded I sign over control of my finances. He arrived home with Sarah, Jake the real estate agent, and another man I didn't recognize, all carrying briefcases and wearing the confident expressions of people who believed they were about to close a deal. "Mom, we need to finish this tonight," David announced without preamble. "Everyone's cleared their schedules to get the paperwork completed. No more delays." I looked at the 4 of them standing in my living room, surrounding me like sharks who'd finally cornered their prey. They had spreadsheets, contracts, transfer documents, and applications, everything needed to completely dismantle my life and rebuild it according to their specifications. "Before we start," I said calmly, remaining seated in my armchair while they arranged themselves around my coffee table, "I have some questions about a few things that have been troubling me." David's jaw tightened with impatience. Mom, we've answered all your questions. Multiple times. It's time to stop stalling and— Actually, I interrupted gently, my questions aren't about the arrangements you've made. They're about some other matters. For instance, David, does your employer know you've been sharing confidential client financial information with unauthorized third parties? The room went very quiet. David's face flushed red, but before he could respond, I continued. Because according to the ethics code at Morrison, Blake and Associates, yes, I looked it up, employees are strictly prohibited from discussing financial matters with anyone not directly involved in the professional relationship. Yet you've given my personal banking information to Robert Chen. Jake here has detailed knowledge of my property values, and Patricia Walsh knows intimate details about my income and assets, all without my written consent. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Morrison, David assured us he had your authorization to— Did he show you any documentation of that authorization? I asked. Any signed papers giving him the right to share my private financial information with strangers? The silence that followed was answer enough. I didn't think so, I said. Which means everyone in this room except me has participated in what's legally considered financial fraud. Interesting position for an accounting firm employee to put himself in, don't you think? David found his voice, though it came out higher and more strained than usual. Mom, you're being ridiculous. I was trying to help you. Help me? I stood up slowly, feeling taller and stronger than I had in months. Let me tell you what you were actually doing, David. You were attempting to commit elder abuse, financial exploitation, coercive control. Those aren't my words. They're legal terms I learned from the attorney I've been consulting with. Sarah's mouth fell open. Attorney? You hired an attorney? I consulted with one, I corrected. Legal aid services are wonderful resources for people facing exactly the situation you've put me in. Eleanor Rodriguez was very interested in my case, especially after I played her some recordings I've made over the past few weeks. Recordings? David's voice cracked on the word. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small device, setting it on the coffee table next to their stack of documents. Oh yes, recordings of you stating your intention to control all my financial decisions. Recordings of Sarah explaining how this is really about your career and your plans, not my well-being. Recordings of Patricia admitting that once I sign these contracts, I'll have virtually no ability to change my mind or regain my independence. The four of them stared at the device like it was a poisonous snake. All perfectly legal, I continued conversationally. This is a one-party consent state, which means I can record any conversation I'm part of without telling the other participants. Very helpful law for protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. Jake was already standing up, gathering his papers with shaking hands. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just providing market analysis based on information I thought was authorized. There's been no misunderstanding, I said firmly. You've all been very clear about your intentions. The question now is what we do about it. David tried to regain control of the situation. Mom, you're obviously confused about what's been happening here. We've been trying to help you, and now you're attacking us with lawyers and accusations. I'm not attacking anyone, I said. I'm simply making sure everyone understands the legal reality of what you've been attempting to do to me. Would you like me to play some of the recordings so we can all hear exactly what's been said? That won't be necessary, the fourth man said quickly. I still didn't know who he was, but his panicked expression suggested he wanted to be anywhere else. Actually, I think it would be very illuminating, I said, reaching for the device. Especially the conversation where Sarah explained that I don't deserve credit for raising my son because that was just my job and that David's career is more important than my housing security. Sarah's face went white. You can't use those recordings. That's invasion of privacy or something. It's evidence, I corrected. Evidence that will be very interesting to several people. David's employer, for instance. I'm sure Morrison, Blake and Associates would be fascinated to learn that one of their employees has been attempting to defraud his own mother while violating client confidentiality standards. David's confident mask finally slipped completely. Mom, please. You don't understand the damage you could do to my career. Your career? I laughed, and it felt good to laugh, even if the sound was sharp and bitter. You mean the career I sacrificed everything to make possible? The career I funded by working double shifts and living on nothing while you went to college? That career? But what about when you were in college, David? I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. What about that incident during your senior year? The one you made me promise never to tell anyone about? The one that could still cost you your professional license if the right people found out? The color drained completely from David's face. Behind him, Sarah looked confused, clearly hearing about this mysterious incident for the first time. What incident? She asked, looking between David and me. Oh, David hasn't told you? I said with mock surprise. How interesting. I thought couples shared everything with each other. David, would you like to explain to Sarah why you nearly didn't graduate? Why you made me drive to your college at 2 a.m. and beg the dean not to press charges? Mom, please, David whispered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Or shall I explain how you stole money from the Student Emergency Fund? How you forged signatures on withdrawal forms? How the only reason you weren't arrested was because I promised to pay back every penny and convinced them you were just a confused kid making a stupid mistake? Sarah stared at David with growing horror. You stole money? From an emergency fund? It wasn't like that, David said desperately. I was going to pay it back. I just needed— You needed money for spring break in Cancun, I said flatly. Money you stole from a fund designed to help students who couldn't afford to eat. Students like the ones I was working 3 jobs to make sure you'd never be. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Jake frantically shoving papers into his briefcase, clearly desperate to escape before this family drama destroyed his business reputation. Now, I said, sitting back down and folding my hands in my lap, let me explain how things are actually going to work from now on. First, all of these documents are going back wherever they came from, unsigned. Second, there will be no more unauthorized sharing of my personal information with anyone. Third, there will be no more meetings in my home to discuss my future without my explicit invitation. But Mom, David started. I'm not finished, I said sharply, and the authority in my voice made him close his mouth immediately. Fourth, if anyone in this room ever again attempts to coerce me into signing over my financial independence, or threatens my housing security, or treats me like an incompetent child, I will not hesitate to file formal complaints with the appropriate authorities. That includes the State Attorney General's office, David's employer, and the licensing boards for anyone who's violated professional ethics in this room. I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it wide. This meeting is over. Everyone except David needs to leave. Now. Jake practically ran for the door, followed by the mysterious fourth man who still hadn't identified himself. Sarah hesitated, looking between David and the door, clearly torn between curiosity about the college incident and desire to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Sarah, I said pleasantly, I believe you have somewhere else to be. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, pausing only to hiss at David. We need to talk. Tonight. After they left, David and I stood alone in my living room for the first time in months. He looked smaller somehow, younger, like the scared college kid who'd called me crying at 2 a.m. because he'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to fix it. Mom, he said quietly, I never meant for things to get this complicated. You meant to steal my independence and sell my home, I replied. You meant to treat me like an incompetent burden who needed to be managed and controlled. You meant to erase me from my own life. Those things don't happen by accident, David. They happen because someone decides another person doesn't matter enough to deserve respect. He sat down heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. I thought I was helping. I thought you'd be happier if you didn't have to worry about all these decisions. You thought you'd be happier, I corrected. You and Sarah would be happier if I was warehoused somewhere convenient where I couldn't embarrass you or interfere with your plans. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about my happiness. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the room that had suddenly become much larger. The distance between us measured not in feet, but in trust, broken, and respect lost. What happens now? He asked finally. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the confident young man who'd been trying to control my life, but the frightened boy who'd made a terrible mistake and learned that actions have consequences. Now, I said, you decide who you want to be, The man who tries to steal from his mother, or the man who remembers where he came from and who made his success possible. The choice, I realized, had always been his to make. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden on a warm spring morning, watching the roses I'd planted the year before James died finally bloom in brilliant red cascades along the fence. The morning sun felt gentle on my face, and for the first time in over a year, I felt truly at peace in my own home. David had moved out 3 weeks after our confrontation. The breakup with Sarah had been swift and brutal once she learned about his college theft and realized what kind of man she'd been planning to marry. Apparently, a woman who valued financial security and social status above all else, wasn't particularly interested in a partner with a history of fraud and a mother who wouldn't be contributing to their lifestyle. I'd watched him pack his belongings with mixed emotions. There was sadness, of course. No mother wants to see her child leave under such circumstances. But there was also relief, and something that felt surprisingly like pride. For the first time in months, I was watching my son face the consequences of his choices, rather than being shielded from them by my willingness to absorb the damage. "I'm sorry, Mom," he'd said as he loaded the last box into his car. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I never meant for it to go that far." "I know you didn't," I'd replied, and I meant it. But meaning well isn't enough when you're making decisions that affect other people's lives. You forgot that I'm a person, David, not just your mother, not just an obligation or a problem to be solved. A person with my own thoughts and feelings and rights. He'd nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "How do I fix this? How do we fix this?" "We don't," I'd said gently. "You fix yourself, and I fix myself. And maybe someday we figure out how to have a relationship that isn't based on you needing something from me, or me sacrificing something for you." That had been 6 months ago, and in that time, I'd discovered something remarkable. I actually liked the person I was when I wasn't constantly trying to be what someone else needed me to be. The house felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. I'd rearranged the furniture to suit my preferences rather than David's. Hung pictures I'd been storing in closets because he thought they were too sentimental, and turned his old bedroom into a craft room where I was learning to paint watercolors. At 55, I was finally discovering what I enjoyed doing when no one else's needs were dictating my choices. Work had become more satisfying too. Without the constant stress of David's demands and criticisms, I found myself more present with my patients, more creative in finding ways to bring them comfort and dignity. Mrs. Garcia, who'd replaced Mrs. Patterson as my regular patient, had become something like a friend. She was 89 years old, but sharp as a tack, and she loved hearing about my newfound independence. "You remind me of myself after my husband died," she told me one afternoon while I helped her with her physical therapy exercises. "Everyone thought I'd just wither away, but instead I learned to drive, took up photography, and traveled to places I'd always wanted to see. Sometimes losing something you thought you needed is the best thing that can happen to you." I'd started taking evening classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when David's needs consumed all my energy and resources. I was studying psychology, fascinated by the dynamics of family relationships and the ways people learn to value themselves. My professor, Dr. Williams, had suggested I might want to consider getting a degree in social work or counseling. "You have natural empathy and life experience that would be invaluable in helping other people navigate difficult family situations," she'd said, after I'd written a particularly insightful paper about elder abuse and family manipulation. The idea was growing on me. At 55, I was young enough to have a second career, and the thought of helping other people avoid the trap I'd fallen into felt like a way to transform my painful experience into something meaningful. Eleanor Rodriguez had become not just my attorney but something like a mentor. After my case was resolved, David had signed documents acknowledging his inappropriate behavior and promising never to attempt financial coercion again. She'd invited me to volunteer with her legal aid organization. "We need people who understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this kind of manipulation," she'd explained. "People who can sit with clients and say, 'I know exactly what you're going through,' and mean it." I'd started volunteering 2 afternoons a week, helping intake new clients and providing emotional support to people facing situations similar to what I'd experienced. It was difficult work, hearing stories of adult children who'd drained their parents' accounts, spouses who'd used emotional manipulation to gain financial control, family members who'd convinced elderly relatives to sign over property and assets. But it was also deeply satisfying when I could look a frightened 70-year-old woman in the eye and tell her that she had more power than she realized, that there were laws to protect her, that she didn't have to accept being treated like a burden. And when I could see the hope return to her face, I felt more useful and valuable than I'd ever felt scanning groceries or even caring for patients. The greatest gift, though, had been discovering my own worth outside of what I could provide for other people. For so many years, my identity had been wrapped up in being David's mother, James's wife, my patient's caregiver. I'd measured my value by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice, how useful I could be to people who needed something from me. Now, I was learning to value myself for simply existing, for the thoughts I had and the dreams I was finally pursuing, and the quiet strength I'd discovered when I stopped trying to earn love through self-erasure. I was learning that being alone didn't mean being lonely, that independence didn't mean isolation, that setting boundaries didn't make me selfish. David had called twice since moving out. The first time, about 3 months after he'd left, to tell me he'd been seeing a therapist to understand how he'd become the kind of person who could treat his mother the way he had. Dr. Peterson says I learned to see you as an extension of myself rather than a separate person, he'd said during that awkward phone call. Like you existed to serve my needs rather than having needs of your own. She says that's common in families where one parent dies and the surviving parent sacrifices everything for the child. It sounds like you're learning important things, I'd replied carefully. I am, but Mom, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong by loving me too much. I did something wrong by taking advantage of that love. The second call had come just last week. David had wanted to tell me he'd found a new apartment, started dating someone new, a woman who worked as a teacher and apparently had no interest in his financial status or family background. Her name is Rebecca, he'd said, and there was something different in his voice when he talked about her. Something humble and grateful rather than possessive and controlling. She's helping me understand what a healthy relationship looks like, what it means to care about someone without trying to control them. I'm glad, I'd said, and meant it. Would you maybe like to meet her sometime? Not right away. I know we still have a lot of work to do, but eventually? I'd thought about it for a moment, testing my own feelings. Was I ready to let David back into my life in any capacity? Was I willing to risk the peace I'd found for the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with my son? Eventually, I'd said finally. When we're both ready. When you're sure you can see me as Margaret, not just as David's mother. I understand, he'd said. And Mom, thank you. For not giving up on me completely. For fighting back when I needed you to fight back. I know it would have been easier to just give in. After I hung up, I'd sat in my garden for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and boundaries and the difference between love and enabling. I wasn't ready to fully trust David again. That would take time and consistent evidence that he'd truly changed. But I was open to the possibility that people could grow, that mistakes didn't have to define someone forever, that relationships could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. The roses were in full bloom now, their fragrance filling the morning air with sweetness and promise. James would have loved seeing them like this, would have been proud of the garden I'd created and the woman I'd become. Sometimes I felt his presence in quiet moments like this. Not as sadness for what I'd lost, but as gratitude for what he'd given me. Not just love, but the foundation of strength I'd built upon when life demanded more of me than I thought I had. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, scanning groceries and measuring her worth by her willingness to sacrifice everything for a son who'd forgotten she was human. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered with compassion, but couldn't imagine being again. I'd learned something that had taken me 55 years to understand. Love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's self-destruction disguised as virtue. Real love requires respect, reciprocity, and the recognition that every person, even mothers, even caregivers, even people who choose to serve others, deserves to be seen and valued for who they are rather than what they can provide. The phone rang inside the house, probably Dr. Williams calling about my final project for the semester. I had work to do, classes to attend, clients to help, a life to live that belonged entirely to me. I stood up slowly, brushing soil from my hands, and walked toward the house I'd nearly lost, the home I'd saved by remembering my own worth just in time. Behind me, the roses continued blooming, beautiful and strong and completely themselves, asking nothing from anyone except the chance to grow in their own soil, in their own time, in their own magnificent way.